They buried him at sunrise and called it justice, but by sundown the truth had already begun to rot beneath their feet. The wind moved slow across Dry Creek that morning, carrying dust like it had somewhere better to be, slipping between boots, brushing past the wooden posts, settling on shoulders that refused to look down. Elias Whitmore stood alone when they brought him out, hands steady, eyes quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't beg or break, just watched. No one spoke his name, not the men who had traded with him, not the ones who had borrowed his tools, not even the ones who had once shared his fire on cold nights when the temperature dropped below 40 and the prairie turned hard as iron. It was easier that way, easier to let a man become a story before he was even gone. The accusation had come quick, too quick for questions to take root. The bank had been opened at dawn, the safe left empty, and by mid-morning the whispers had already chosen their direction. By noon, someone had ridden out and found the money tucked inside Elias's barn, stacked neat like it had been waiting to be discovered. No sign of struggle, no sign of haste, just certainty placed carefully where it would be believed. And belief, out here, didn't need proof. It only needed a man with no one to defend him. Elias didn't run. That was the first thing they used against him. A guilty man would run, they said. A smart man would fight. But Elias just stood there when they came, wiping his hands on a worn cloth, glancing once toward the horizon like he was measuring distance instead of fate. "You got something to say?" one of them asked, voice sharp with the kind of courage that only shows up in groups. Elias looked at him, then at the others, then down at the dust collecting on his boots. "No," he said, and that was all. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't surrender. It was something heavier, something that didn't fit inside their need for a simple ending. They took that silence and shaped it into guilt, built a whole verdict out of it before the sun reached its peak. By the time they gathered in the square, the story had already been decided. A thief caught, a town protected, order restored. No one asked how a man who could barely fill his own pantry had managed to break into iron and walk away unseen. No one asked why the money sat untouched instead of spent. Questions required courage, and courage was in short supply that day. The rope hung still in the dry air, unmoving, like even the wind didn't want to be part of it. Elias stepped forward when they told him to. No hesitation, no resistance, just a man walking where others had pointed. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. He looked certain, like he understood something the rest of them didn't, like he had already seen how this would end, and it wasn't here. The town watched, some with hard eyes, some with empty ones, a few with something softer, buried too deep to matter. And when it was over, they turned away faster than they had gathered, boots kicking up dust, voices returning to normal, as if a man's name hadn't just been erased from the world. By afternoon, the sun burned high and unforgiving, and Dry Creek went back to being what it always was, a place where truth didn't matter nearly as much as comfort. They buried Elias Whitmore beyond the fence line. No marker, no prayer, just a patch of earth that looked no different from the rest. And by nightfall, the town had already begun to forget him. But the wind didn't forget. It never does. It carried something else that day, something quieter than dust, something slower than regret. A beginning, not of revenge, not of reckoning, but of truth, waiting its turn. Dry Creek did not change overnight, not in ways that could be pointed at or measured, but something in the air shifted, subtle as a door left slightly open. The bank stood at the center of town like it always had, tall windows catching the sun, polished wood gleaming as if nothing had ever touched it, as if no accusation had ever been born within its walls. Samuel Crow arrived each morning at exactly 8, his boots clean, his coat pressed, his presence steady enough to make people believe in order again. That was his gift. Not honesty, not kindness, but the ability to make others feel safe in a story that benefited him. Men tipped their hats when he passed. Women nodded politely. No one mentioned. The rancher buried beyond the fence line. Silence, once chosen, becomes habit faster than truth ever could. The sheriff kept his office door open more often those days, though no one came in with questions. He would sit behind his desk, staring at the same piece of paper longer than necessary, fingers resting on the edge like he was waiting for it to speak first. Sometimes he would glance toward the window that faced the road leading out of town, the one that disappeared into open land, the one that led past the unmarked patch of earth. But he never walked it. Not once. Because walking that road meant admitting something had been left unfinished. And unfinished things have a way of asking for answers. The people of Dry Creek learned quickly how to adjust their memory. It was not a lie, not exactly. It was more like a smoothing over, like sand erasing footprints until no one could tell where anyone had stood. Elias Whitmore became less a man and more a caution, a name used quietly when someone needed to remind another of what happened to those who stepped out of line. Do not end up like him, they would say, without ever saying what he had actually done. The details faded first, then the doubt, then the discomfort. What remained was a version of events that required no reflection, and that version was easier to live with. Seasons turned. Summer burned the land until the grass curled and cracked. Fall came in with cooler winds that rattled the shutters at night. Winter followed, slow and heavy, pressing silence into every corner of the town. Snow covered the roads, the rooftops, even the edge of the land beyond the fence line. For a while, it covered everything equally, truth and lie alike. But snow does not last. It melts. It always melts. And when it does, it leaves behind what was there all along. Samuel Crow expanded his business during those years. Bought more land, extended loans, tightened his hold on the town in ways that felt invisible but undeniable. People depended on him now. That was how power worked here. Not through force, but through need. If he said something was true, most people accepted it before the question had time to form. And if doubt ever flickered, it was quickly pushed aside, buried under routine, under survival, under the quiet understanding that some truths cost more than they were worth. But not everyone forgot in the same way. There were a few who carried something heavier than silence, something that did not settle no matter how much time passed. A glance held too long. A sentence cut short before it could finish. A hesitation when Elias Whitmore's name almost slipped into conversation. These were small things, easy to miss, but they were there, like cracks in wood that had been painted over too many times. And cracks, no matter how small, have a way of spreading. Years passed like that, steady and uneventful on the surface, the town growing, the story hardening into something that felt permanent. Until one morning, long after most had stopped thinking about the man beyond the fence line, a figure appeared at the edge of Dry Creek, walking slowly along the same road no one else chose to take anymore, carrying something small, something old, and something that did not belong to the version of truth the town had learned to live with. She did not arrive with noise, and that was the first thing that made people notice her. Dry Creek was used to horses, to wheels, to men who announced themselves with dust and distance. But this figure came on foot, steady and unhurried. Each step measured like she had already decided where she would stop long before she reached it. Clara Whitmore wore no colors that called attention, just a faded coat the color of worn leather, boots that had seen miles, and a hat pulled low enough to keep her eyes shaded but not hidden. In her right hand, she carried a small wooden box, edges softened by time, the kind of box that had been opened and closed so many times it no longer needed hinges to remember how. People watched from doorways as she passed, not because she looked dangerous, but because she did not look uncertain. Travelers usually paused, asked for directions, scanned the buildings like they were trying to find their place inside them. Clara did none of that. She walked straight down the main road, past the general store, past the blacksmith, past the watering trough where men often gathered to talk about things they did not fully understand. Conversations slowed as she moved through them, words trailing off like they had lost their purpose. One man lifted his hat halfway, then stopped, unsure whether the gesture was meant for her or for the memory she seemed to carry with her. She did not acknowledge anyone, not out of pride, not out of fear, but out of focus. Her attention was fixed on something ahead, something that existed beyond the buildings, beyond the people, beyond the version of the town that had been built on forgetting. When she reached the center, she stopped. Not at the bank, not at the sheriff's office. She turned slightly, just enough to face the road that led out past the last fence, the one that most people avoided without ever saying why. For a moment, she stood there, still as the wooden posts lining the street, the wind catching the edge of her coat and pulling it gently behind her. Then she continued, walking past the final row of houses, past the place where the ground began to open up into quiet land. A boy watched her from a distance, curiosity stronger than caution. He had grown up hearing the story, though not in full, never in full, just pieces shaped into something simple enough to understand. He followed at a distance, careful not to be seen, his boots pressing into the same dirt that had once carried another man's last steps. Clara did not turn around. She knew he was there. She knew the town was watching in the only way it knew how, from behind windows, from behind silence. The fence came into view, weathered wood leaning slightly, as if even it had grown tired of standing in one place for too long. Beyond it, the land stretched quiet and undisturbed, except for one place where the earth sat just a little differently, not raised, not marked, just remembered by the ground itself. Clara stepped over the fence without hesitation, the box still steady in her hand. She walked to that place and stopped. The wind eased. Even the distant sounds of the town seemed to pull back, like they understood this was not a moment to interrupt. She knelt slowly, placing the wooden box on the ground in front of her. Her fingers rested on it for a second longer than necessary, not out of doubt, but out of respect. Then she opened it. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white, lay a folded letter sealed with dark red wax that had never been broken. Clara looked down at it, her expression unchanged, but something in the air shifted again, the same way it had years ago, only this time it did not feel like something being buried. It felt like something being brought back. Clara did not break the seal right away, and that was the second thing that unsettled the moment, because anyone who carried something for years would have been expected to open it the first chance they got. But she did not come here for curiosity, she came for timing. Her fingers traced the edge of the wax, not to test it, not to weaken it, but to remember it. The boy stood a few yards behind her now, close enough to see the shape of the letter, close enough to feel that whatever was inside that folded paper carried more weight than anything he had been told growing up. He shifted his boots in the dirt, the sound small but loud enough in the stillness, and Clara finally spoke without turning around. "You can come closer," she said, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, just certain. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward, each step slower than the last until he stood beside her, eyes fixed on the box, on the letter, on the place in the ground that had no name, but carried one anyway. "Is that his?" he asked, not saying the name, because names had been taught carefully in Dry Creek, some spoken freely, others kept behind teeth. Clara nodded once. It always was. The wind picked up again, just enough to move a strand of her hair across her cheek, and she brushed it back with the same hand that had held that letter across miles of road and years of silence. "Why did you not open it before?" the boy asked, the question coming out before he could stop it, because children still believed answers came when questions were asked. Clara looked out across the land instead of at him, her gaze resting somewhere far beyond what he could see. "Because truth does not change with time," she said quietly, "but people do." The boy did not fully understand, but he felt something in the way she said it, something that made him stand still instead of asking more. Clara reached into the box and lifted the letter, the paper stiff with age but intact, the seal unbroken despite everything it had endured. She held it for a moment, not above the ground, not away from it, but level, as if offering it back to the place it had been kept from. "He never had the chance to speak," she said, more to the air than to the boy. "So we wait until someone is ready to listen." The words settled between them, heavy but not loud, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was a sense that this was not just about one man, not just about one moment buried under years of quiet agreement. This was about something larger, something that had been allowed to grow in the absence of truth. Clara turned then, finally, her eyes meeting the boy's, and there was no anger in them, no accusation, only a steady clarity that made him look down before he realized why. "Does your father speak of him?" she asked. The boy shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am." Clara gave a small nod, as if that answer had been expected, as if it confirmed something she had already known before stepping foot into the town. She looked back at the letter, then at the distant line where the buildings of Dry Creek stood against the horizon. "Then it is time someone does." She placed the letter back into the box, closed it gently, and stood up, brushing the dust from her knees with a calm that did not match the weight of what she carried. The boy stepped back as she moved past him, her path now leading not away from the town, but directly toward it, toward the place where silence had been shaped into certainty. Behind them, the unmarked ground remained as it was, but something had shifted, Something small but irreversible, like the first crack in a surface that had held too long. And as Clara walked back toward Dry Creek, carrying the letter that had waited longer than anyone else had, the wind followed, not behind her, but with her, as if even it understood that some truths are not meant to stay buried. Clara did not slow as she stepped back into Dry Creek, and that was the third thing that made people uneasy, because hesitation is what the town understood. Hesitation meant doubt, and doubt meant control, but she carried neither. The wooden box rested steady in her hand, not hidden, not displayed, just present, like something that did not need permission to exist. Conversations faded again as she passed, but this time they did not resume as quickly. A few men turned fully to watch her instead of pretending not to notice, their eyes following the line she walked as it led straight toward the bank. Samuel Crow stood just inside the doorway, speaking with a rancher about numbers and land, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind that filled space without raising itself. He saw her before she reached the steps, and for a fraction of a moment, something in his posture shifted, so slight it could have been missed if not for how quickly it disappeared. He finished his sentence, nodded to the man, and stepped outside, closing the door behind him with care. "Ma'am," he said, polite, measured, the tone of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet. Clara stopped a few feet from him, leaving space between them that felt deliberate, not cautious, but defined. She did not remove her hat. She did not offer a greeting. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady enough that it made the silence stretch longer than comfort allowed. "You have something that belongs to this town," she said. Crow's expression did not change, but his eyes flicked briefly to the box, then back to her face. "I believe everything here belongs to the town already," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips, the kind meant to ease tension without addressing it. Clara tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgment of the game being played. "That depends on what the town knows," she said. A few people had gathered at a distance now, not close enough to interrupt, but not far enough to ignore. The sheriff stood near his office door, watching without stepping forward, his hand resting on the frame like he needed something solid to lean against. Crow glanced around briefly, taking in the eyes, the quiet, the shift he could feel but not yet name. "If you have business, we can discuss it inside," he said, gesturing toward the bank, offering privacy as a form of control. Clara did not move. "No," she said simply. "This was never meant to be private." The words settled into the space between them, and for the first time, the air felt heavier than the heat of the day. Crow's smile faded just enough to reveal something firmer beneath it, something that had not been challenged in years. "You are mistaken if you think stirring old matters will serve anyone," he said, his voice still calm, but tighter now, like a rope pulled just enough to hold. Clara lowered the box slightly, her fingers resting on its edge. "Old matters do not disappear," she replied. "They wait." The boy stood at the edge of the gathering, his eyes moving between them, sensing something he could not yet name but knew he would remember. Clara opened the box slowly, not with urgency, not with drama, but with the same care she had shown at the edge of the land. The hinges creaked softly, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside, the letter lay exactly as it had before, sealed, untouched, patient. Crow's gaze fixed on it now, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his eyes, only recognition. Clara lifted the letter, holding it up just enough for him to see the seal, the color, the shape of something he had once believed would never return. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Clara did not break the seal. Not yet. She simply held it there, between them, between what had been said and what had never been allowed to be heard. And in that stillness, something shifted again, deeper this time, like the ground itself was beginning to remember what it had been asked to forget. No one reached for the letter, and that was the fourth thing that mattered, because in Dry Creek people were used to taking what they could hold, what they could count, what they could lock behind doors, but this was something different, something that could not be owned once it was seen. Clara held it steady, her arm neither raised in challenge nor lowered in retreat, just present, like a line drawn across the middle of something that had gone too long without one. Samuel Crow looked at the seal again, longer this time, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition he could not deny. "You," Should be careful what you carry into a place like this, he said, his voice softer now, the smooth edge replaced by something more measured, more deliberate. Clara did not blink. I have been careful, she replied. For years. The sheriff shifted his weight near the door, the wood creaking under his hand, a small sound that seemed to remind him he was still part of this moment, whether he stepped into it or not. His gaze moved from the letter to Crow, then to Clara, as if he was trying to find a place to stand that would not collapse under him. Miss, he began, his voice uncertain. If there is something to be said, it ought to be handled proper. Clara turned her head slightly toward him, just enough to acknowledge his presence. Proper would have been years ago, she said, not harsh, not loud, just true. The words settled into him, and he looked away first. Crow took a step forward, slow, controlled, his boots pressing into the dust with a weight that had always carried authority. A sealed letter proves nothing on its own, he said, his tone regaining some of its firmness. Anyone could claim anything about what is inside. Clara nodded once, as if agreeing with the logic, but not the conclusion. That is why it has not been opened, she said. Not yet. A murmur moved through the small crowd, quiet but present, the sound of people adjusting their understanding without fully admitting it. The boy leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the letter, on the moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Clara lowered the letter back toward the box, not to hide it, but to change the way it was seen, from something held between two people to something placed before all of them. There are things written here that were never meant to be read alone, she said. Crow's jaw tightened, just enough to show the strain beneath his control. And you believe this town will suddenly decide to question what has already been settled, he said. Clara looked at the people gathered, really looked at them now, one by one, not accusing, not pleading, just seeing. I believe this town has been waiting longer than it admits, she replied. No one answered her, but no one turned away either. That was new. That was different. The silence this time was not the same as before. It was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of something beginning to shift. The sheriff stepped forward then, slow but certain, his hand leaving the door behind him. He stopped a few feet from Clara, his eyes on the box, on the letter, on the space where his own decisions had once stood without question. If that is to be opened, he said, his voice steadier now, it should be done where all can hear it. Clara met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something like approval in her expression, not for what had been done, but for what might be done now. She closed the box gently, her fingers resting on it for a brief moment before lifting it again. Then we do it together, she said. And as she turned toward the center of the town, toward the place where voices carried and could not be easily ignored, the people followed, not because they were told to, not because they were forced, but because something inside them had begun to move, something that had been quiet for years and was no longer willing to stay that way. They gathered in the center of Dry Creek the way people do when something cannot be ignored anymore, not in a rush, not in panic, but in a slow tightening circle where distance no longer feels safe. The sun sat high above them, casting no shadows deep enough to hide in, and that mattered more than anyone said out loud. Clara stepped into the open space without asking for it, the wooden box still in her hands, its weight unchanged though the meaning inside it had begun to grow. The sheriff stood to her left now, not ahead, not behind, but beside, as if choosing his place carefully for the first time in years. Samuel Crow remained a few steps away, close enough to be part of what was happening, far enough to pretend he was not yet affected by it. The people formed a loose circle, boots scraping lightly against the ground, hats pulled lower, arms folded not in defiance but in uncertainty. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever words they had no longer felt strong enough to hold the moment together. Clara set the box down on a worn wooden crate near the center, the kind used for hauling supplies, now carrying something far heavier than goods. She opened it slowly, the same careful motion, the same quiet respect, and lifted the letter once more. This time, she did not hold it between herself and another. She turned, just slightly, so that all could see it, the seal intact, the paper aged but unbroken, the weight of years pressed into its folds. This was written the night everything changed, she said, her voice steady, carrying across the circle without force. It was never opened, not because it was hidden, but because no one asked for it. A few men shifted their stance, the truth in that sentence landing heavier than accusation ever could. The sheriff looked down briefly, then back up, his jaw set in a way that suggested he had already stepped too far to turn back now. Crow folded his hands in front of him, a practiced gesture, but there was a stillness in his shoulders that had not been there before. Clara ran her thumb along the edge of the seal, not breaking it, just feeling it one last time. Once this is opened, she continued, it cannot be closed again. Not in paper, not in memory. The boy stood near the outer edge of the circle, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with the kind of attention that only comes when something real is about to happen. Clara glanced at him for a moment, then back to the letter, as if reminding herself why this mattered beyond the past. The wind moved through the circle, light but present, stirring coats, brushing dust across the ground, carrying the faint sound of something shifting deeper than the surface. Clara placed her finger under the edge of the wax seal. For a brief second, everything seemed to pause, the town, the people, even the breath held in their chests. Then, with one steady motion, she broke it. The sound was small, barely more than a soft crack, but it carried farther than any shout could have. No one moved. No one spoke. Clara unfolded the letter carefully, the paper resisting slightly before giving way, like something long closed finally remembering how to open. She did not read it yet. She looked down at the words, her eyes moving across lines written years ago, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not shock, but confirmation. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting the eyes of those around her, one by one, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something that had not been present before, not just truth, but the weight of it being heard. And in that moment, before a single word was read aloud, Dry Creek understood that whatever came next would not ask for permission to change what had already been decided. Clara drew in a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to give the moment the space it deserved, and then she began to read, her voice clear, unhurried, each word placed carefully as if it had weight that could not be rushed. To whoever finds this, she said, her eyes moving across the page, if you are reading, then something has gone wrong in a way I could not prevent. A ripple passed through the circle, subtle but undeniable, the kind that moves through people when they recognize a voice they were never meant to hear. Clara continued, her tone unchanged, letting the words carry themselves. My name is Samuel Crow, and what I write here is not for defense, but for record. The money taken from the bank was never stolen. It was moved. By me. The air shifted again, sharper now, like a line drawn across the past that could not be ignored. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Even Crow did not move, though something in his face had gone still in a way that no longer resembled control. Clara read on. I arranged the removal to cover losses that could not be explained without losing everything I have built. I intended to return it quietly, but circumstances changed when Elias Whitmore discovered the ledger discrepancy. A man near the edge of the circle let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, his hat lowering just slightly, as if to hide from the words themselves. Clara's voice did not rise, did not accuse, it simply continued. He came to me with questions, not threats, not demands, questions. He gave me a chance to make it right. I chose not to. The sentence settled into the ground beneath them, heavier than anything spoken before. Clara's eyes moved to the next line, and for the first time, there was a faint tightening at the corner of her expression, not emotion, but recognition of what was coming. I placed the money in his barn before dawn. I knew how it would look. I knew what the town would do with what it saw. I told myself it was necessary. A murmur rose, not loud, not chaotic, but present, the sound of certainty beginning to fracture. The sheriff's shoulders dropped slightly, as if something he had been holding for years had finally been set down, though not by his own hand. Clara continued, unwavering. If this is being read, then I did not find the courage to speak this myself. That failure belongs to me alone. Elias Whitmore was an honest man. He deserved better than what I allowed to happen. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, impossible to bend into anything else. Clara lowered the letter slightly, not finished, but letting the weight of that truth settle before continuing. She looked up then, her gaze moving across the faces in front of her, Men who had stood in that same circle years ago. Men who had said nothing. Men who had believed what was easier. No one met her eyes for long. Not because they were afraid of her, but because they were no longer sure of themselves. Clara returned her attention to the page. If there is any justice left in this place, she read, it will not come from punishment. It will come from acknowledgment, from naming what was done and who it was done to. The wind moved again, stronger this time, lifting dust from the ground and carrying it through the circle, as if the land itself was responding to something finally spoken aloud. Clara folded the letter slowly, not closing it away, but marking the end of what needed to be said. She did not look at Crow. She did not need to. The words had already done what no accusation could. And in the silence that followed, Dry Creek stood not as it had been, but as something exposed, something that could no longer pretend it did not know. No one moved to speak for a long moment, and that silence felt different from the ones before, not empty, not avoiding, but heavy with something that had finally been placed where it belonged. The circle did not break, but it shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the ground beneath their boots had settled into a new shape. Clara stood still beside the crate, the folded letter resting in her hand now, no longer hidden, no longer waiting. The sheriff took a slow step forward, then another, his hat lowering slightly as he approached the center, his eyes not on Clara, but on the space just in front of her, as if he was careful not to claim more than his place allowed. "We were wrong," he said, his voice not loud, not commanding, just clear enough to be heard by those who needed to hear it. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed where they were meant to. A man near the back shifted his weight, his boots scraping the dirt, and then he spoke, quieter, almost to himself, but loud enough to carry. "We never asked," he said. Another voice followed, older, rougher. "We did not want." The admissions came slowly, not in a rush, not as a confession, but as something being uncovered piece by piece, like boards lifted from a floor no one had touched in years. Samuel Crow remained where he stood, but the space around him had changed. It was not distance that separated him from the others now, but something less visible, something that had been named and could not be taken back. He looked at Clara, then at the sheriff, then at the people who had once stood with him without question. There was no anger in his expression, no attempt to argue what had already been written, only a quiet understanding that the structure he had built no longer held. "You carried that for years," he said to Clara, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier polish. Clara nodded once. "He did not have the chance," she replied. Crow's gaze dropped briefly, then returned, but there was no longer anything to defend. "And now you believe this fixes it," he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement searching for shape. Clara looked at him, not with judgment, not with victory, but with something steadier. "Nothing fixes it," she said, "but it can be named." The sheriff drew in a breath, then turned slightly, facing the circle, facing the town in a way he had not done before. "Elias Whitmore," he said, the name spoken fully now, without hesitation, without lowering his voice, was not a thief. The words moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass, touching each person differently, but leaving none unchanged. The boy felt it most clearly, the way a name could sound different when it was said with truth instead of warning. A woman near the edge removed her hat, holding it against her chest, her eyes fixed on the ground, not in shame alone, but in recognition. One by one, others followed, not because they were told to, not because there was a rule, but because something inside them understood what was being returned. Clara placed the letter back into the box, closing it gently, not as something finished, but as something fulfilled. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply stood, allowing the moment to belong to those who had needed it. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying less weight than before, as if it no longer had to hold what had been left unsaid. And in that quiet, Dry Creek did something it had not done in years. It did not look away. The circle did not dissolve when the words settled, and that was the fifth thing that mattered, because Dry Creek had always been quick to return to routine, quick to scatter after anything uncomfortable, but this time no one seemed to know where to go next. The sheriff remained where he stood, his shoulders no longer squared with authority, but held in place by something heavier than duty. He looked toward the edge of town, toward the road that led beyond the fence line, and for the first time in years, his gaze did not turn away. "We put him out there," he said quietly, not asking, not declaring, just acknowledging something that had been known all along. A few heads nodded, slow, reluctant, but real. Clara watched without stepping in, her hands resting lightly on the closed box, her role already shifting from messenger to witness. One of the older men, a rancher with sun-worn skin and a voice that carried years of dust and silence, cleared his throat before speaking. "Then that is where we start," he said. No one argued. No one offered another idea, because there was no other place to begin. The movement came gradually, not as a command, but as a shared understanding. Boots turned. Hats lowered. The circle loosened and stretched into a line, not ordered, not perfect, but moving in the same direction. Clara stepped aside as they passed, not leading them, not following, simply allowing the town to walk a path it had avoided for too long. The boy moved with them, his steps quicker now, his eyes fixed ahead, no longer uncertain of where he was going. Samuel Crow did not move at first. He stood where the center had been, the empty space around him larger than before, the distance no longer chosen by him, but created by what had been spoken. He watched as the others began to leave, as the sheriff stepped forward onto the road, as the line of people formed without looking back. For a moment, it seemed as though he might remain there, anchored to the place where his version of the story had once held firm. Then, slowly, he took a step, not to reclaim anything, not to lead, just to follow. The road stretched out under the afternoon sun, the dust rising with each step, carried by a wind that no longer felt heavy. No one spoke as they walked. There was no need. The silence now carried purpose instead of avoidance. The fence came into view, the same worn posts, the same uneven line, but it did not look the same as it had before. It looked closer, more present, as if the distance between the town and that patch of ground had never been measured in miles, but in something else entirely. The sheriff reached it first. He stopped, his hand resting on the top rail, fingers pressing into the wood like he needed to feel it, to know it was real. He did not climb over right away. He stood there, looking out, his breath steady but deeper than before. Then, without a word, he stepped over. One by one, the others followed, not waiting, not hesitating, each crossing in their own time, each step carrying something they had not known how to carry before. Clara came last, her boots landing softly on the other side, her gaze already fixed on the place ahead. The ground had not changed. It had never needed to, but the way they approached it had. And as they moved toward that unmarked space, no longer as individuals avoiding a memory, but as a town willing to face it, something shifted again, not in the land, not in the wind, but in the way they stood within it. Not above it, not beyond it, but finally, with it. They stopped a few feet from the unmarked ground, not because there was a barrier, but because something in them understood that stepping closer required more than movement. The sheriff removed his hat first, holding it against his chest, his fingers tightening around the brim as if it were the only steady thing he had left. One by one, others followed, not in unison, not as a ritual they had practiced, but as something instinctive, something that did not need to be taught. The wind moved softly across the open land, brushing past them, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and earth warmed by the sun, a reminder that time had continued even when truth had not. Clara stepped forward then, not to lead, but because the space before her had been waiting longer than the others. She knelt again, the same way she had before, but this time she was not alone. The sheriff moved beside her after a moment, lowering himself slowly, the weight of the years visible in the way he settled onto one knee. He reached out, hesitated, then placed his hand lightly on the ground, his fingers pressing into the soil as if trying to feel something beneath it. "We left him here," he said quietly, the words no longer an observation, but an admission that carried its own shape. Clara did not respond. She did not need to. The others stood behind them, some stepping closer, some remaining a few feet back, each finding their own distance from what they were finally facing. The boy stood near the front now, closer than before, his eyes fixed on the place where nothing marked what had been done, and for the first time, he understood that absence could carry more weight than any stone. An older woman stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she removed a folded piece of cloth from her pocket. She knelt opposite Clara, placing it gently on the ground, smoothing it out with careful fingers, as if preparing a place that should have been prepared long ago. No one asked her to do it. No one stopped her. The sheriff drew in a slow breath, then spoke. Again, not to Clara, not to the crowd, but to the ground itself. Elias Whitmore, he said, the name steady now. We did not listen. The words hung there, simple, unadorned, and for a moment, it seemed like that was all there was to say. But silence did not follow the way it had before. It opened instead, making space for something else. A man behind them stepped forward, removing his hat, his voice rough but clear. You helped me fix my fence one winter, he said, looking down. I never thanked you. Another voice followed, quieter, almost hesitant. You gave my boy a horse when I could not afford one. The memories came slowly, not as a flood, but as a steady stream, each one placing something back where it had been taken away. Clara listened, her gaze steady, not correcting, not guiding, just allowing the truth to take its full shape through the people who had once refused it. Samuel Crow stood at the edge, his hat still on, his hands at his sides, his eyes fixed on the ground but not stepping forward. He listened too, each word landing differently for him, not as memory, but as measure. Clara reached into the wooden box then, her movements calm, deliberate. She removed the folded letter once more, but this time she did not open it. Instead, she placed it gently on the cloth, the paper resting flat, no longer hidden, no longer waiting to be read, but now part of the ground it had been kept from. The sheriff watched her, then nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of acknowledgment. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what needed to be said had already begun to take root. And as they stood there, not above the ground, not separate from it, but finally connected to it, Dry Creek did something it had never done before. It remembered him not as a story, not as a warning, but as a man. The wind eased into something gentler, no longer carrying the weight of what had been hidden, but moving through the space like it finally had room to breathe, and the people of Dry Creek stood there not as a crowd anymore, but as something quieter, something more honest, each of them holding a piece of what had been returned. Clara remained kneeling for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly beside the letter, not touching it, just near enough to feel its presence. And then she rose slowly, brushing the dust from her coat with the same calm she had carried since the road first brought her here. The sheriff stood as well, placing his hat back on his head, though not the same way as before, not with authority, but with a kind of humility that did not need to announce itself. He looked out across the land, then back at the people, and something in his expression had changed, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that no longer avoided it. We should mark this place, he said quietly, not as an order, not as a correction, but as something overdue. A few heads nodded, slow but certain, and a man stepped forward, already looking around as if measuring where a stone might stand, how deep it would need to go, how long it would take to do what should have been done years ago. No one spoke of cost. No one asked who would pay, because this was not about ownership anymore. It was about acknowledgment. Clara stepped back, giving space, her role complete in a way that did not require recognition, and the boy watched her, realizing that she was not staying, that whatever had brought her here was not meant to keep her. Are you leaving? He asked, his voice softer now, shaped by something he had learned without being told. Clara looked at him, her expression steady, then glanced once more at the ground, at the letter, at the people who had begun to move, to act, to repair something without being told how. I came to return something, she said. It is not mine to keep. The boy nodded, though he did not fully understand, but he felt it, the way some things pass through a place and leave it different without staying behind. Behind them, the older woman adjusted the cloth, smoothing it again as if preparing it for something that would last longer than memory, and the sheriff spoke quietly with two men about bringing wood, about shaping something simple, something honest. Samuel Crow remained at the edge for a moment longer, his figure still, his gaze fixed on the ground where the letter lay, and then he stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just once, enough to close the distance he had kept. He removed his hat slowly, holding it in both hands, and though he did not speak, his presence there said more than any defense could have. No one turned to him. No one asked anything of him, because what needed to be faced was already before him. Clara turned then, her boots pressing lightly into the dirt as she walked back toward the fence, toward the road, toward the horizon that had not changed, only the people within it had. The boy watched her go until she crossed the fence and did not look back, her figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of land, until she became part of it, the same way the wind did, the same way truth does when it has been spoken and no longer needs a voice to carry it. Behind her, Dry Creek did not return to what it had been. It could not. The ground now held more than silence. It held a name, a truth, and a beginning that did not come with noise or force, but with something quieter, something stronger, the willingness to stand still and finally see what had always been there. By the next morning, the first light of dawn touched something that had not existed the day before, not because the land had changed, but because the people had, and that difference showed in the way the marker stood, simple, unpolished, set by hands that had once turned away but now chose to remain. It was not tall, not carved with grand detail, just a solid piece of wood placed firmly into the ground, its surface marked with careful letters burned in slow, deliberate strokes. Elias Whitmore. An honest man. Nothing more. Nothing less. The words did not try to explain. They did not try to undo what had been done. They simply stood, steady and clear, the way truth always does when it no longer needs permission. The sheriff stood a few feet back, his hat in his hands again, though this time there was no hesitation in the way he held it. He looked at the marker for a long moment, then turned slightly as others gathered behind him, not in a crowd, not in silence, but in something quieter, something more grounded. A man placed a small stone at the base. Another adjusted the soil around it. The older woman returned, smoothing the cloth once more, then leaving it folded neatly beside the marker, as if it belonged there now. No one rushed. No one gave orders. Each movement carried intention, not performance. Samuel Crow arrived last. He did not approach from the center, did not walk with the others, but came along the edge of the land, his steps measured, his posture no longer shaped by ownership, but by something far more difficult to carry. He stopped a few feet from the marker, his gaze fixed on the name, on the words that had replaced the ones he had once allowed to exist. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he removed his coat and folded it over his arm, as if shedding something that no longer fit. He stepped forward, just once, and placed a small ledger book on the ground beside the marker. No explanation, no speech, just the quiet return of something that had been part of the lie. Then he stepped back. No one stopped him. No one followed him, because what mattered had already been done. The boy stood near the front again, his eyes moving from the name on the marker to the people around him. And he understood now in a way that would stay with him long after this day passed, that justice did not always arrive with force, did not always announce itself with sound. Sometimes it arrived like this, slow, steady, carried by people willing to stand still long enough to face what they had avoided. Clara was gone, her path already part of the horizon, but her absence did not feel like something missing. It felt like something completed. The wind moved through Dry Creek once more, lighter than before, brushing past the marker, past the people, past the fence, carrying nothing that needed to be hidden anymore. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light evenly across the land, the town did not turn away this time. It did not look for something else to focus on. It stayed. It remembered. And in that stillness, in that quiet acknowledgment, something rare took root, not loud, not visible, but lasting. Out here, justice did not need to be declared. It only needed to be seen. And once it was, it stayed.